My name's Christelle McLaren and I'm an occupational therapist. I work at the Institute for Urban Indigenous Health. Part of my role is coordinating with the universities, with the clinical educators about when we take students and also what their caseload might look like while they're with us. And the OT students that we take usually work in an interprofessional model, particularly if they're working in the paediatric setting. So most of what I will do will be before the students actually arrive, so working out their timetables, talking to the staff, the clinicians that are actually going to take the students, and setting up with those clinicians days of the week, what clinics they'll be attending and expectations as well. So with the occupational therapy students, they might do a combination of paediatric and adult caseload. And so through that we will actually, all the OT students are usually using the multiple mentoring model. I guess the benefits that we have of that is that we can actually allow the students to work across a few settings with different clinicians. And so there's quite a lot of coordination prior to that to make sure that they're actually getting the supervision from those clinicians, but that the caseload's at a level that they can actually work at and it's not too much for them as well. We do actually really look at the feedback that the students provide us with, and I guess over time that has actually led us to change the way that we do some of the things, but particularly in probably the preparation and the planning phase. So from that, what we've actually developed is we actually have some forms and checklists in place that we use when we're actually in the planning phase of students, so before the students actually come. So it's having a key checklist of the main things that each of the clinical educators need to be aware of. So who the key clinical educator is, the dates people are starting, what the student's orientation looks like, who's responsible for the student and when, who's responsible for liaising with the university, and just being aware of things like that when their halfway evaluation is and who's responsible for coordinating that, particularly if you've got multiple clinicians inputting into like the SPEFR and things like that. So I guess one of the things that has enabled us to do is actually set up some of those documents for planning so that we do feel organised prior to the students turning up, and it's not like they turn up and we all go, oh, whoops, we forgot they were coming. So it's being, I guess, planned ahead of time and actually making sure that we have like a little planning meeting a few weeks before they're arriving, making sure everyone's very clear about who's doing what. Also within that, we do have structures like, how are you going to provide your supervision to the student? And even though our clinicians are usually out from the main office, they're usually on site at clinics and they might be a different clinic every day. It might be using things like, okay, you're going to use the travel time with the student to do some debriefing then, or that sort of thing. So we actually structure that in so that everyone's very clear about how and when those other activities occur. I guess the other thing about having students when they're on placement is you invariably will have a student that might be a little more challenging in terms of them being able to keep up with the workload or just building up their background knowledge for different caseloads that they might be having. So I guess the challenge around that is also not only supporting the student but also supporting the clinical educator. And so there have been occasions where we have had a student whose progression in their skill acquisition hasn't been as what we'd want. So it's being able to work with the clinician and the supervisor around how do we then build our skills to support the student. And I guess that is a challenge, particularly if you've got a staff member who it might be the first time they've had a student, and we have had that occur. And it's really, I think, encouraging for them to understand that there's different ways, there's different strategies that you can use to support students, and them also bringing different knowledge as well. And I think the nice thing about the multiple mentoring model is that each of us as clinicians work differently, so it's not like the student has to become like one of us, but they can learn different skills from each of us. And I think it's also nice that the clinicians, even if we do have a challenging or a student that's finding something difficult, can actually learn from the other supervisors about how you might do something differently. I guess one of the things that I've found with the clinicians is a lot of them are initially a little nervous about having a student for the first time. But I think nearly every one of them at the end of the placement has said to us how much they've learnt themselves by having a student and how much they actually have learnt from having to articulate their own clinical reasoning out loud to a learning student as well. So that's been really positive for me, because sometimes you think, oh, they've never had a student, how's it going to go? But it's always been really positive in the fact that the clinicians have come back and said how much they've learnt themselves and their own professional development from having to do that with a student.